The first snow of the season had laced itself along the balustrades of Wychford Park, settling in the formal gardens like fine white nap, drawn smooth by a patient hand. The house stood foursquare and rather severe upon its rise of ground, its mullioned windows reflecting the dying October light like so many watchful eyes, while a faint smell of beeswax and recent flowers lingered in the great hall where ancestral portraits gazed down with expressions of perpetual, well-bred composure. Sir Lionel Carstone moved through his domain with the measured tread of a man accustomed to command, his silver hair catching the amber glow that old panelling lends to drawing-rooms warmed by coal fires, his manner one of polished courtesy, tempered by something approaching weariness as he prepared to welcome an eclectic gathering that would unite for tomorrow's ceremony the theatrical and the respectable. The arrival of the London contingent had been managed with characteristic discretion, their motor cars sweeping up the gravelled drive to deposit their occupants at the front steps where Sir Lionel waited with the sort of welcome that acknowledged both their professional distinction and their essential otherness. Miss Ianthe Vale emerged first, a woman of perhaps 50 whose bearing suggested she had never in her life doubted her right to occupy whatever space she chose to claim, her dark travelling coat and severe hat doing nothing to diminish the sense of controlled authority that seemed to emanate from her very presence. "My dear Miss Vale," Sir Lionel said, his hand outstretched, his expression grave to the point of aloofness, "your kindness to join us." She answered with composure, her voice carrying the trained clarity of a well-schooled contralto, while behind her came the bride herself, Rosamond Gray, moving with that particular grace that marked her as a creature of the stage, her fair hair caught beneath a becoming cloche that framed features of such delicate perfection they seemed almost too refined for the robust demands of theatrical life. Peregrine Dacres descended from the second motor car with elaborate care, his lean figure draped in evening clothes that had seen better days, but were worn with such casual elegance that their shabbiness became a kind of distinction. He approached Sir Lionel flourishing a script like a banner, contriving to appear both modest and unusually noticeable, his greeting delivered with that faint trace of an accent that spoke of origins somewhat less elevated than his present circumstances might suggest. "Dacre," Sir Lionel observed, as if acknowledging some ancient and amiable nuisance, while the playwright bowed elaborately to the stage, the walls, the air, and then to Sir Lionel as an afterthought. Within the house, Mrs. Arkwright moved through her duties with the silent efficiency of one who had spent decades learning to observe without appearing to notice, her sharp eyes taking note of how voices carried through Wychford's panelled corridors with a clarity that might surprise those unaccustomed to the house's particular acoustics. She had arranged the guest chambers with her customary attention to precedence and propriety, though she could not help but remark to herself upon the curious mixture of breeding and bohemianism that now occupied the ancient rooms where portraits of long-dead Carstones gazed down upon theatrical trunks and grease-paint cases with what might have been either approval or consternation. The private theatre, Sir Lionel's grandfather's particular folly, proved the perfect setting for Dacre's nuptial masque, its intimate proportions and elaborate stage machinery, creating an atmosphere of contained drama where even the simplest rehearsal seemed to approach ritual. The piece itself was a delicate confection of classical allusion and contemporary sentiment, designed to flatter both the bride's professional accomplishments and the groom's family traditions, with Julian Carston cast as a shepherd prince, and Rosamond as the woodland nymph who would abandon her sylvan freedom for the bonds of earthly love. As the evening's rehearsal progressed, there emerged a curious tension between the scripted movements and the unscripted glances, between the carefully choreographed entrances and exits and the more subtle dance of personalities, feeling their way around one another in the confined space. When Dacres called for the climactic blackout that would transform nymph into bride, the darkness proved complete and disorienting, that velvety blackness which makes one's own breathing sound impolite. In the dark, a rustle was distinctly heard where movement should not have been, and then a voice, No actor's line spoke with chilling clarity. "Not before I have told him, Father." The word hung in the darkness like a challenge, followed by the oddest breath, neither sob nor laughter, before the sudden flood of returned light revealed the assembled company, standing precisely where they ought to be, their expressions politely neutral, yet somehow changed. The late dinner that followed was conducted with the sort of restrained elegance that Witchford's dining room seemed to demand, conversation flowing around topics that touched upon everything except what might actually be occupying the thoughts of those present. Julian spoke with careful enthusiasm, while Miss Vale contributed observations on theatrical tradition that managed to be both illuminating and somehow evasive. Sir Lionel presided with his customary grace, though those who knew him well might have detected a certain preoccupation beneath his courteous attention, as if his thoughts were occupied with matters that could not be shared even in such intimate company. As the evening drew toward its close and the guests began to disperse toward their chambers, there lingered in the ancient corridors of Witchford Park a sense that the real performance had only just begun, and that tomorrow's ceremony might witness revelations far more dramatic than any scripted masque could provide. The private theatre at Witchford Park lay within the old house like a jewel set in ancient gold, its intimate proportions and faded maroon upholstery exhaling the faint perfume of dust and old roses that belongs to theatrical spaces where dreams have been enacted for generations. The stage itself bore the precise geometry of Tom Beale's chalk marks, white crosses, and arcs that mapped the players' movements with professional exactitude, while the cue lights stood sentinel in the wings, their amber eyes waiting to guide the performers through the masque's climactic transformation. Above, the elaborate storm machinery crouched in readiness, that curious assemblage of drums and wind sheets that would shortly fill the air with manufactured tempest. Miss Ianthe Vale occupied the front row, with the bearing of one accustomed to command. Her notebook balanced upon her knee, her pencil poised to record any detail that might require adjustment before tomorrow's ceremony. She watched the proceedings with that particular intensity that marked her as a professional observer of human behavior, missing nothing as Julian Carston took his position as the shepherd prince, and Rosamond Gray arranged herself among the painted trees with a grace that seemed to transform artificial woodland into something approaching enchantment. Tom Beale moved through his duties with quiet competence, his weathered hands adjusting pulleys and testing switches with the confidence of long practice, while Peregrine Dacres lounged in the auditorium, his script bristling with penciled amendments, ready to prompt should any performer require assistance. "Places, if you please," Miss Vale called, her trained voice carrying easily through the intimate space, and the assembled company moved to their marks with the careful precision of dancers who had rehearsed their steps until they had become second nature. The masque proceeded through its opening scenes with increasing smoothness, the artificial storm building to its crescendo as Julian's shepherd prince declared his intention to follow his beloved from the realm of fantasy into the world of mortal commitment. Then, at Dacres' signal, Tom Beale's steady hand plunged the stage into that complete and disorienting darkness that only theatrical blackouts can achieve. In the enveloping blackness, where even one's own breathing seemed impolite, there came the whisper of movement where no movement should have been. Someone, not quite where he ought to be, moved a pace closer than the geometry of the scene required. A breath, warm and unwelcome, touched another's cheek with disturbing familiarity. Then a voice spoke with startling clarity, neither scripted line nor stage direction, cutting through the manufactured storm like a blade. "Not before I have told him, Father." The word hung in the darkness with terrible precision, followed by what might have been a stifled gasp, before Tom Beale's reliable hand restored the lights and revealed the assembled company standing in their proper positions, their faces bearing expressions of polite attention that somehow failed to disguise a collective sense of disturbance. Rosamond Gray stood precisely where she ought to have been, her costume undisturbed, her hair still perfectly arranged beneath its circlet of artificial flowers. Yet something in her bearing had changed, as if the darkness had taken something from her and left something else in its place. Miss Vale observed her protégée with the sharp attention of one who had spent decades learning to read the subtle signs by which performers betray their inner states. After a moment's consideration, she closed her notebook with decisive finality. "I believe that will suffice," she announced, her voice carrying that note of calm authority which brooked no discussion. Perfection requires no further rehearsal. It was Tom Beale who discovered the damage to the bridal veil, examining the delicate lace with professional concern in the property room. The tear was small but unmistakable, a fresh rent that had certainly not been present during the afternoon's preparations. "Wasn't there when I hung it up," he muttered to Mrs. Arkwright, who had come to inquire about the morning's arrangements. "Someone's been at it, but who'd want to damage such a pretty thing?" He held the lace to the light, frowning at the precise nature of the tear, as if seeking some clue in its very threads. The late supper that followed was conducted in the smaller dining room, where family portraits seemed to draw closer to the candlelight and the polished silver-reflected flames in points that made a rippling company of their own. Dacres entertained with his customary wit, his observations delivered with that particular blend of insight and gentle malice that marked him as both observer and participant in the social comedy being enacted around him. Miss Adelaide Carstone revealed beneath her habitually stern expression an unexpected warmth, her conversation with Rosamond displaying a kindness that seemed to surprise even herself. Sir Lionel presided with his usual grace, though those who knew him well might have detected a certain preoccupation in his manner. As the evening drew toward its close, he pleaded a sudden headache, withdrawing with apologies so elaborate and courtly that they seemed to carry meanings far beyond their surface courtesy. In the lamp-shadowed corridors that followed, as the household prepared for sleep, Mrs. Arkwright paused in her final duties to observe the house settling into its ancient rhythms. The panelled walls, polished by generations of housemaids, seemed to exhale their faint fragrance of timber and beeswax, while somewhere in the distance a window fastening clicked with unnecessary emphasis. It was then that she glimpsed two figures moving through the dimness with the silent grace of moths drawn to flame, one proceeding purposefully toward the chapel door, the other slipping away in the opposite direction, both moving with such careful quiet that their very stealth seemed to proclaim the significance of their separate errands. She stood perfectly still until both had disappeared into the darkness, her expression thoughtful and her step perhaps a trifle less certain than usual as she continued on her way. The chapel at Wychford Park stood apart from the main house like a prayer carved in stone, its Norman arches catching the first pale light of what should have been a wedding morning. Frost had settled upon the ancient stones with delicate precision, transforming the carved saints above the doorway into figures wrapped in crystal veils, while the path from the house traced a silver line through the winter-dark lawns. Within the rectory that adjoined the chapel, the Reverend Mr. Rivington had been roused from sleep by a tap so discreet yet so insistent that it seemed to speak of matters that could not wait for the conventional proprieties of daylight. He opened his door to find Rosamond Gray upon his threshold, her face pale as morning mist, her travelling cloak drawn close about her shoulders as if she sought protection from something more penetrating than the October cold. She spoke in tones scarcely above a whisper, requesting a few moments of quiet prayer in the nave before her wedding day began in earnest, her manner suggesting that this was not merely the natural nervousness of a bride, but something approaching desperation. He admitted her without question, lighting the altar candles with his own hands before withdrawing to the vestry, where the thin partition that separated his study from the nave allowed him to maintain a respectful vigil while affording her the privacy she sought. Through the ancient oak boards, he heard the unmistakable cadence of a deeply troubled heart, not the measured responses of formal prayer, but the broken rhythm of one seeking guidance in circumstances that seemed to offer no comfortable resolution. Her voice rose and fell in whispered supplications, while the chapel itself seemed to lean in to listen, its stones holding centuries of similar confidences in their patient embrace. Then, after perhaps a quarter-hour had passed, another voice joined hers, restrained yet urgent, speaking in tones too low for words to carry clearly through the partition, though the emotional weight of the conversation was unmistakable. The exchange possessed that quality of suppressed intensity that marks conversations where much hangs in the balance, until suddenly the second voice ceased with an abruptness that seemed to echo through the chapel like a door slamming shut. The morning that followed brought all the familiar rituals of a country wedding. Fresh flowers arrived from the village in careful profusion, their scent filling the corridors with promise of celebration, while the organist rehearsed the processional one final time. Mrs. Arkwright moved through her preparations with characteristic efficiency, though those who knew her well might have detected a certain tension in her manner, as if she carried knowledge that weighed upon her conscience. The servants stepped carefully around questions they were not asked to answer, their eyes avoiding direct contact with those who might seek information they were not prepared to give. It was Tom Beale who made the discovery, arriving at the theater to make final adjustments to the stage lighting. His cry of alarm brought the household running, their footsteps echoing through corridors that had known such sounds before, but never in circumstances quite so terrible. Rosamond lay upon the stage where she had rehearsed her role as woodland nymph, but now she was arranged with a perverse artistry that suggested eternal repose. The torn bridal veil wound tightly around her throat, her hands folded across her breast, her hair spread upon the boards like spun gold against dark timber. Sir Lionel arrived within moments, his face grave beyond the reach of ordinary sorrow, and issued a single, controlled command for discretion that carried the weight of absolute authority. Julian appeared as if summoned by nightmare, the color draining from his face so completely that the blue veins in his temple showed like fine pen lines, making a brief, desperate movement toward the still form before strong hands prevented him from disturbing what had become evidence of the most terrible kind. Miss Adelaide Carstone knelt beside the stage in silent prayer, her devotions offered without ostentation, while Ianthe Vale stood perfectly straight, her professional composure intact as she watched everything and nothing with eyes that seemed to catalogue details for some future reckoning. Tom Beale, his weathered hands steady despite the shock, noted aloud that the arrangement seemed deliberate. The careful positioning, the methodical winding of the veil, the tender smoothing of hair that spoke of hands familiar with such ministrations. A faint smudge of green upon the delicate lace caught the morning light, transferred perhaps from the painted shrubs that stood stage left, while the chalk marks that had guided the previous evening's rehearsal bore witness to movements that had strayed from their prescribed geometry. The motor car that sped toward the railway station carried with it an urgent message bound for London, summoning Scotland Yard to investigate what would surely be remembered as the most refined of tragedies. As the wheels turned upon the frost-hard road, Wychford Park settled into the peculiar stillness that follows upon the discovery of murder, its ancient stones preparing to witness an investigation that would probe not merely the mechanics of death, but the more complex mysteries of the human heart that had led to this moment of terrible artistry upon a stage meant for celebration. A thin, pewter light lay upon Wychford Park when the motor car from London turned through the gates and approached the house with that particular discretion which marked its occupants as gentlemen who understood the delicate nature of their mission. Inspector Roderick Alleyn emerged first, followed by Inspector Fox, both men dressed in quiet, unobtrusive clothes of excellent quality, their bearing suggesting not the heavy-handed authority of provincial constabulary, but rather the refined competence of those accustomed to moving within circles where tact was valued as highly as efficiency. The frost that had shaped itself upon the lawns in minute filigree remained largely unbroken, while within the house itself the resonant hush of a place accustomed to ceremony was broken only by the soft tick of an 8-day clock in the hall. Sir Lionel Carstone received them in the library, where leather-bound volumes and family portraits created an atmosphere of scholarly repose that seemed almost to mock the terrible circumstances that had necessitated their presence. The introductions were conducted with that punctilious attention to form which crisis often renders more rather than less important, and Alleyn's grey eyes took careful note of the way tension manifested itself in the precise arrangement of objects upon the writing desk and the almost military straightness with which Sir Lionel held himself. "Inspector," Sir Lionel said, his voice carrying that note of controlled courtesy which the house itself seemed to demand, "we are deeply obliged for your prompt attendance." Alleyn answered with characteristic gentleness, "You will allow us to be as little troublesome as possible, Sir Lionel. If I might first have the general plan of the house and the liberty to walk it." The response came with a trace of steel beneath the politeness. "You shall have both." Alleyn spent his first crucial hour walking what he privately termed the significant lines of the estate, moving from chapel to theatre to dressing rooms with the measured pace of one who understood that architecture itself could serve as both facilitator and witness to human drama. The narrow corridor that connected the main house to the theatre wing proved particularly revealing, its panelled walls creating an acoustic chamber where even carefully modulated tones seemed to acquire additional resonance. He paused to test this phenomenon, speaking quietly to Fox and noting how whispers carried from one end to the other with startling clarity. A conversation in the chapel, he observed, might be overheard from the theatre passage. Sir Lionel's acknowledgment was minimal but telling. "It has been remarked upon." In the theatre itself, where the tragedy had unfolded, Alleyn conducted his examination with methodical precision, his long fingers moving over surfaces and objects with the delicate touch of a pianist exploring an unfamiliar keyboard. The torn bridal veil, now carefully preserved as evidence, revealed upon close inspection a knot of curious construction, neither the simple binding that panic might produce, nor the elaborate complexity that premeditation might devise, but something between the two that suggested both urgency and a certain familiarity with the properties of fine lace. The precise arrangement of the victim's hair struck him as equally significant, the careful smoothing and positioning speaking of hands that had performed such ministrations before, creating an effect of peaceful repose where violent struggle would surely have produced disarray. Tom Beale, questioned about the previous evening's technical arrangements, proved a reliable witness whose professional training had taught him to observe timing and sequence with mechanical precision. Blackout lasted exactly 47 seconds. He reported, his weathered hands demonstrating the switch positions with unconscious accuracy. Miss Ianthe Vale, consulted about her directorial cues, displayed the sort of precise recall that marked her as a woman accustomed to maintaining control over complex enterprises, though Alleyn detected beneath her professional composure a quality of watchfulness that suggested she was observing him as carefully as he was observing her. When she removed her gloves, soft kid, and set them upon the back of a stall, Alleyn's glance met them as a matter of habit, noting the faint inward crease of the left that spoke of a hand that did more work than its fellow. Peregrine Dacre offered his recollections with characteristic flourish, his account embellished with gallant trifles. Yet Alleyn noted that beneath the theatrical manner lay a sharp intelligence that missed very little. Julian Carston, questioned about his movements during the fatal blackout, maintained with desperate insistence that he had never left his marked position on the stage, his assertion delivered with the sort of vehemence that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as his interrogator. From the servants, Alleyn collected those small, stubborn facts that only domestic staff are positioned to observe. Mrs. Arkwright's report of a lingering, exotic scent in an unexpected location, something from a gentleman's buttonhole, if I may say. The under-housemaid's discovery of a glove dropped and later mysteriously retrieved, and Tom Beale's professional note of a smudge upon the stage floor that had certainly not been present during the afternoon rehearsal. In the property room, Fox discovered a pair of gloves bearing the unmistakable crease pattern of distinctly left-handed usage, their positioning suggesting they had been carefully placed rather than carelessly mislaid. As the afternoon wore on, Witchford Park began to reveal itself to Alleyn's trained perception as an elaborate stage set, its pattern of entrances and exits, its acoustic properties and sightlines becoming increasingly clear. It was while examining a small service door cut into the arbre paneling, no more than a tradesman's convenience, that he paused, his hand finding the latch moving with the silent recoil of something recently used. At that moment, so faint as to be almost doubtful, there came a breath of that same exotic fragrance Mrs. Arkwright had detected, floating past in the otherwise empty passage like a line forgotten in a play. Alleyn stood quite still until the scent thinned and vanished. Then, not smiling, he drew the door gently to, leaving 1 inch of darkness visible between door and jamb. A small but significant detail in a house where appearances had proven so thoroughly deceiving. The green room at Witchford Park's private theatre possessed that particular quality of faded elegance which belongs to spaces perpetually adjacent to performance, its walls bearing the soft patina of age beneath framed engravings of actresses whose names had long since passed from memory. A chaise longue of worn burgundy velvet yielded with a whispered sigh to any weight placed upon it, while the mantelpiece, adorned with an ormolu clock that measured time in theatrical beats, supported an array of grease-paint pots and powder boxes that spoke of decades of transformation and artifice. The faint odor of size and spirit gum lingered in the air, softened by the more domestic scents of beeswax and the coal fire that burned quietly in the grate, casting gentle shadows across Persian carpets worn thin by the passage of countless players. Inspector Alleyn had chosen this room for his interviews with deliberate consideration, understanding that its theatrical associations might encourage a certain frankness, while its intimate proportions would discourage the sort of formal posturing that drawing rooms often inspired. He arranged 2 chairs at comfortable angles to the hearth, with Inspector Fox positioned unobtrusively near the door, his notebook ready to capture those small details that often proved more revealing than grand declarations. The atmosphere Alleyn created was one where confidences might be offered as courtesies rather than extracted as duties, transforming what might otherwise feel like interrogation into something approaching civilized discourse. Miss Ianthe Vale entered first, bringing with her that rare quality of imposing order merely by her presence, her severe traveling dress and carefully arranged hair lending her an air of professional authority that seemed to fill the room with quiet confidence. She settled herself with characteristic economy of movement, removing 1 glove with practiced precision before meeting Alleyn's gaze with unflinching directness. When he spoke of Rosamond, her responses came with the clarity of well-trained diction, each word chosen for its exact meaning rather than its emotional effect. The child possessed that luminosity which transcends mere technique, she observed, her voice steady despite the evident feeling beneath. She brought truth to artifice, Inspector, which is the rarest of theatrical gifts. Alleyn noted how her hands remained perfectly controlled throughout their conversation, though when she spoke of the girl's talent, something flickered across her austere features that suggested depths of affection carefully held in professional check. Peregrine Decres succeeded her with characteristic flourish, his entrance somehow managing to acknowledge both the tragedy of their circumstances and his own irrepressible theatricality. He settled himself as if preparing for a soliloquy, his script clutched dramatically against his chest, and proceeded to transform even simple questions into opportunities for elaborate performance. His account of the previous evening's events came embellished with gallant trifles and artistic observations, suggesting a man more comfortable with performance than reality. Yet beneath the surface charm lay a sharp intelligence that missed very little of what transpired around him. When questioned about a small smear of green upon his cuff, He acknowledged it with unabashed candor. "A regrettable encounter with one of our painted shrubs, Inspector." Mr. Beale was most reproving. The admission came with such theatrical resignation that it seemed almost calculated to disarm suspicion. Julian Carston presented himself with that surface of chivalrous propriety which barely concealed a rigid emotional control, his bearing suggesting a young man trained from childhood to regard the expression of feeling as a form of weakness. His responses carried the mechanical precision of lessons learned by rote, while his hands remained clasped behind his back with military straightness. Of Rosamond, he would speak only in the most formal terms, as if any display of genuine emotion might somehow compromise her memory or his own dignity. She was everything a gentleman could desire in a wife. He stated with such careful emphasis that the words seemed to echo in the quiet room like a challenge to contradiction, though his voice caught almost imperceptibly on the past tense. Miss Adelaide Carstone's interview revealed beneath her genteel exterior a decisively steel-like nature, her apparent dislike of ostentation concealing a woman capable of swift, determined action when circumstances demanded it. She spoke of household management with the authority of one accustomed to making decisions that affected the lives of others, while her assessment of their theatrical guests displayed a shrewd understanding of human nature that belied her spinster's reputation for unworldliness. "One learns to observe," she remarked when Alleyn complimented her perceptiveness, "when one's responsibility is to maintain proper standards in circumstances where propriety does not naturally flourish." Dr. Evelyn Pargeter appeared with his inevitable black bag, that eternal attribute of his profession, and answered Alleyn's questions with the practiced caution of one accustomed to guarding professional confidences. Despite his long association with the family, he volunteered remarkably little information beyond confirming his attendance upon Lady Viola's delicate constitution and his general unawareness of any tensions that might have led to such a dreadful conclusion. Yet Alleyn detected beneath the physician's reserved manner a quality of watchfulness that suggested knowledge held in careful reserve, while about his person lingered the faint, clean scent of antiseptic mingled incongruously with something sweeter, the ghost of a flower that did not bloom in October gardens. The Reverend Mr. Rivington entered the green room as if it presented a moral challenge, his clerical collar seeming to restrict his breathing as he confirmed Rosamond's early morning visit to the chapel. When pressed about what he might have overheard during her prayers, his face colored to the roots of his thinning hair, and he invoked pastoral confidentiality with a determination that seemed to surprise even himself. "There are confidences, Inspector," he declared with unexpected firmness, "that belong to a higher authority than earthly justice." His very embarrassment, however, made it abundantly clear that something of considerable significance had transpired within those ancient walls. Mrs. Arkwright, summoned with appropriate tact, provided the most concrete evidence of the night's clandestine activities. Under Alleyn's gentle questioning, she admitted that a letter had disappeared from Rosamond's personal writing case, while her carefully arranged trousseau showed unmistakable signs of systematic searching. "The bridal room was not as I left it, sir," she stated with the authority of one whose professional pride had been affronted. "Drawers opened that I had closed, not clumsily done, but by someone who knew where to look. There was a gentleman's scent about the place, too. Something from a buttonhole, I'd venture, though such things have no business in a lady's chambers." Sir Lionel, interviewed privately in his study among the leather-bound volumes and family portraits that spoke of generations of unbroken tradition, gave Alleyn the distinct impression of a man bracing himself to keep his household upright at any cost. His responses carried the weight of absolute authority, yet beneath the surface, courtesy lay something approaching desperation. When he spoke of family honor and the importance of protecting his son from further distress, his eyes moved briefly to the portrait above the mantelpiece before returning to meet Alleyn's gaze with renewed determination. "You will find, Inspector," he said with quiet emphasis, "that we are made of old habits here. Some confidences have been kept for generations. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the frost-touched gardens visible through the green room's windows, there emerged with increasing clarity the sense that this murder had been as much about preventing revelation as about silencing a voice. What secret might have been worth such a terrible price remained locked within the elegant discretion that governed every aspect of life at Witchford Park. Yet Alleyn detected in the very air of the place a quality of suppressed knowledge, as if the ancient walls themselves held their breath, waiting for the moment when truth would finally demand its due. The library at Witchford Park possessed that quality of scholarly repose which belongs to rooms where generations of serious men have conducted their most delicate business, its leather-bound volumes rising toward the coffered ceiling like silent witnesses to centuries of family deliberation. The morning light, filtered through mullioned windows that overlooked frost-silvered lawns, fell across the turkey carpet in shifting patterns that seemed to alter with each passing cloud, while the air carried the mingled fragrances of old binding leather, beeswax polish, and the coal fire that burned with quiet authority in the marble hearth. Upon the mahogany writing desk, positioned with the sort of precision that suggested matters of considerable gravity, lay a packet that had arrived with the early post, its London postmark and legal seal bearing the dignity of Lincoln's Inn solicitors. Inspector Alleyn examined the documents with methodical attention, noting the watermarked paper and formal language that spoke of arrangements made with exquisite care decades earlier. The settlement bore unusual terms, its provisions suggesting circumstances that required delicate management, while a note regarding guardianship arrangements carried the weight of decisions made to protect reputations as much as interests. Most significantly, there lay an envelope addressed to Miss Rosamond Gray, in handwriting that possessed the distinctive flourishes of an earlier generation. Assured, spirited, with that suggestion of drama which sometimes clings to correspondence of consequence. When Alleyn later showed this script to Mrs. Arkwright, her reaction proved immediate and telling. A sharp intake of breath followed by that particular stillness which marks recognition, accompanied by profound discomfort. In the small morning parlour where Crown Derby china caught the afternoon light and a kettle sang with domestic contentment upon its trivet, Alleyn encountered Nanny Briggs, whose advanced years had reduced her in person, but not in authority. She sat perfectly upright with her teacup balanced in weathered hands, speaking with the frankness that comes to those who have spent lifetimes in service to great families and understand that earthly proprieties matter less than earthly truth. "There was a child once fostered," she said, her voice carrying the certainty of one who had witnessed what others preferred to forget. "Back when his lordship was young and foolish, as young gentlemen will be. A theatre girl she was, pretty as paint and no more sense than a butterfly." Her faded blue eyes met Alleyn's with perfect directness as she continued, describing a christening deliberately avoided, a young woman who had vanished from the theatrical world with suspicious completeness and arrangements made through the sort of elaborate discretion that only great houses could afford. The old woman's account painted a picture of careful concealment and respectable conclusion. Envelopes arriving with quarterly regularity, always in the same distinctive hand, and a gentleman's messenger who kept his cap in his hand and his eyes upon the ground. "She came back, you see," Nanny Briggs observed, her teacup rattling slightly against its saucer, "though I don't suppose she knew it herself at first. But blood will tell, sir, and there's no mistaking the Carstone eyes when you've seen them for 70 years. Her final words carried the weight of absolute certainty. His lordship knew. I could see it in his face the moment she walked into this house. The conversation that followed in the library, conducted behind firmly closed doors while Inspector Fox maintained his discreet vigil in the corridor, revealed Sir Lionel as a man wrestling with complexities that seemed to age him before Alleyn's eyes. He stood before the portrait of his father, his shoulders rigid with the effort of maintaining composure, as he confided what he claimed to have told no living soul. "I had compelling reason to believe," he said, his voice scarcely above a whisper, "though not absolute proof, that Miss Gray might be my daughter. The dates, the circumstances, certain physical resemblances that became more pronounced as she matured, all suggested a connection that I had hoped time had buried beyond recovery. Sir Lionel's admission carried with it a weight of anguish that seemed to fill the book-lined room like a tangible presence. He spoke of a youthful liaison, an indiscretion from decades past that he had believed forgotten by all but himself until certain observations had begun to stir dormant doubts. He had privately requested Miss Vale to delay the wedding preparations, he revealed, while he sought the definitive confirmation that the solicitor's documents now provided. His voice broke slightly as he vehemently denied any intention of exposing Rosamond to public humiliation or destroying his son's happiness through revelation. "I sought only to prevent a tragedy," he declared, turning at last to face Alleyn with eyes that seemed to carry the accumulated sorrows of generations. If she was indeed my daughter, the marriage could not proceed. If she was not, then my suspicions would die with me, and Julian's happiness would remain undisturbed. Alleyn listened with the careful attention he might have given to a confession that was not quite a confession of murder, measuring the unsparing moral code that governed such establishments against the human cost of its rigid application. The portrait above the mantelpiece seemed to observe their conversation with painted eyes that had witnessed similar scenes of family crisis, while the ticking of the long case clock marked time with the inexorable precision of judgment deferred but not avoided. When Sir Lionel spoke of his anguish at the possibility of unwitting incest, his words carried the authentic ring of a man confronting the consequences of youthful indiscretion across the span of decades. The revelation transformed the whispered word "father" that had echoed through the theatre's darkness from a simple vocative into something far more complex and tragic. If Rosamond had indeed discovered her true parentage, as the legal documents suggested she had, then her pre-dawn visit to the chapel acquired new significance, not merely the nervousness of a bride, but the desperate prayers of a young woman facing an impossible choice between love and propriety. The investigation's central question shifted with subtle but profound significance, moving from the familiar territory of passion and jealousy into the more treacherous waters of family honor and the terrible weight of secrets maintained for decades. As afternoon shadows began to gather in the library's corners, Alleyn reflected upon the curious mathematics of motive that the revelation had created. If Sir Lionel spoke the truth, then he had every reason to prevent the marriage, but none to commit murder. The legal documents would have accomplished his purpose without violence. Yet someone had chosen death over disclosure, suggesting a mind that saw no alternative between revelation and silence. The question that now presented itself with terrible clarity was not who might have hated the bride, but who might have feared the truth she had finally resolved to speak. In the gathering dusk, as the house settled into its ancient rhythms, there seemed to linger in its corridors not merely the echo of that whispered word, but the very ghost of youthful passion returned to haunt Wychford Park, not as romantic memory, but as a force capable of destroying everything the family had built upon its foundation of respectability and careful concealment. The private theatre at Wychford Park lay in the pale afternoon light like a jewel box whose contents had been disturbed by violent hands, its velvet seats turned to quiet plum in the winter sun, and its painted scenery revealing by daylight the careful artifice that darkness had rendered magical. The stage bore Tom Beale's chalk marks with geometric precision, white crosses and arcs that mapped the previous evening's fatal choreography, while in the wings the ropes hung in ordered array and a single lamp burned upon its stand, the ghost light that superstitious theatre folk never quite forgot to leave. The air held that particular fragrance of old timber and size that belongs to theatrical spaces, now mingled with something more astringent that spoke of recent, unwelcome interventions. Inspector Alleyn moved through this space with the measured consideration of a director preparing for a crucial scene, understanding that the theatre's intimate proportions and particular acoustics had made possible not merely performance, but murder conducted with theatrical precision. Tom Beale approached his duties with characteristic thoroughness, his weathered hands moving over switches and pulleys with the confidence of long familiarity, while Inspector Fox positioned himself with notebook ready, his stolid presence providing a counterpoint to the theater's atmosphere of elegant deception. "Shall we proceed, Mr. Beale?" Alleyn said, his voice carrying that note of quiet authority which seemed to fill the house without effort, and the stage carpenter straightened as if to attention. The reconstruction began with ceremonial gravity, each participant taking their assigned position with the careful precision of those who understood that accuracy might prove more significant than comfort. Julian Carstone moved to his mark as the shepherd prince with mechanical obedience, his face bearing that expression of rigid control which had become his habitual mask, while the others arranged themselves according to their remembered positions. At Alleyn's signal, Tom Beale's steady hand brought the storm effects to life, filling the air with manufactured tempest before plunging the stage into that complete and disorienting darkness which only theatrical blackouts could achieve. The darkness proved absolute and strangely intimate, a velvet void that seemed to compress space and dilate time, leaving each person isolated within the compass of their own breathing. Inspector Fox's watch ticked audibly in the silence, marking seconds that stretched like hours. 46. 47. When the lights rose again with sudden brilliance, the distances involved were revealed to be deceptively small, the stage's proportions such that swift, purposeful movement by someone familiar with its geography could accomplish much within the span of less than a minute. "You see, Fox?" Alleyn observed with characteristic understatement. "The terrain is quite manageable for one who knows it well." The examination of evidence yielded details that spoke to both method and opportunity with increasing clarity. The torn bridal veil, subjected to close scrutiny under the theater's working lights, revealed upon its delicate lace a faint smear of green grease paint, an inadvertent transfer that echoed the mask's pastoral setting while providing tangible proof of contact with the painted scenery. Alleyn lifted the fabric to catch the light, his expression thoughtful. "Green upon white," he murmured. "Too deliberate to be accidental. Too theatrical to be coincidental." The scent that lingered about the veil proved equally significant, carrying the distinctive fragrance of gardenia, not the simple flowers of a lady's corsage, but the exotic perfume of a gentleman's boutonniere, speaking of careful selection and personal vanity. The fatal knot itself, when demonstrated upon a wooden block, revealed characteristics that spoke volumes about its creator. Tom Beale, called upon to replicate the binding, showed how the technique required distinctly left-handed manipulation, the crossing and tightening executed with a precision that suggested familiarity with the properties of fine lace. More telling still was the evidence of gentle ministrations performed after death, the careful smoothing of hair, the tender arrangement of hands, suggesting the sort of intimate care that spoke to deeply personal connection rather than the impersonal efficiency of calculated murder. Curious, Alleyn remarked to Fox, that such violence should be followed by such tenderness. Miss Ianthe Vale arrived for her interview with characteristic composure, though Alleyn detected beneath her professional calm a quality of watchfulness that suggested she was observing the proceedings with more than casual interest. When questioned about a pair of gloves discovered beneath a seat in the auditorium, positioned where they might easily be noticed, she maintained with quiet dignity that she had mislaid nothing during the evening's events. "These are not mine, Inspector," she stated with firmness, examining the soft kid leather that bore the telltale impressions of recent, strenuous use. Her own gloves, produced from her reticule, showed none of the distinctive wear patterns that marked their abandoned counterparts. Peregrine Dacres made his entrance with subdued theatricality, his customary wit somewhat dampened by the day's grim proceedings. When confronted with evidence of the missing letter from Rosamond's writing case, a partially burned envelope bearing the Carstone monogram discovered in his grate, His protests came with elaborate vehemence that somehow managed to ring hollow. "I confess to a desperate search," he declared with theatrical resignation, "but for my own correspondence, not hers. I'm guilty of nothing more than financial embarrassment and poor judgment in seeking to remedy it." His admission to what he termed a regrettable lapse carried the calculated quality of confession designed to forestall deeper inquiry. Dr. Pargeter arrived with professional reluctance, his medical case clutched with the protective grip of one unaccustomed to having his instruments subjected to scrutiny. The contents proved disappointingly innocent: thermometer, stethoscope, sal volatile, and various mild tinctures suited to the gentle ailments of genteel invalids. Nothing capable of silencing a throat as effectively as a strip of lace applied by steady, determined hands. "My tools soothe, Inspector," he observed with quiet dignity. "They do not silence." Yet his manner suggested a man whose professional discretion had been tested by circumstances far beyond his usual experience. As the afternoon light began to fade through the theatre's tall windows, casting long shadows across the stage where tragedy had been enacted with such terrible artistry, Alleyn's composed expression suggested that the mechanical aspects of the crime were becoming increasingly clear. The how of murder, the opportunity seized during manufactured darkness, the intimate knowledge of theatrical space, the careful positioning that transformed death into a grotesque parody of peaceful repose. All these elements were falling into place with the inexorable logic of a well-constructed play. The grease paint transfer, the left-handed knot, the exotic scent, the post-mortem tenderness. Each detail added another line to a portrait of murder conducted with both passion and precision. Yet for all the clarity emerging around the mechanics of death, the psychological why continued to cast its heavier shadow over the entire investigation. As the company prepared to disperse and the theatre settled into its ancient quiet, Alleyn paused at the service door that led to the panelled corridor, noting how it stood slightly ajar despite having been firmly closed earlier. A breath of air from the passage carried with it, faint as a whisper, that same exotic fragrance that had clung to the fatal veil. He closed the door gently, his expression thoughtful, understanding that while the stage had revealed its secrets of opportunity and method, the human heart that had driven this terrible performance remained locked behind the elegant discretion that governed every aspect of life at Wychford Park. The ghost light burned on in solitary vigil, illuminating a space where the most convincing performance had taken place not upon the boards, but in the shadowed places where reality and artifice met in their eternal, dangerous dance. The house lay in that pallid interval before dawn, when coals have settled to a thoughtful glow, and the very air seems to hold its breath in anticipation of revelation. Along the panelled corridors of Wychford Park, Persian carpets worn thin by generations of passage muffled even the most careful tread, while the faint scent of old roses and wood smoke mingled with the more recent and unwelcome tang of disinfectant that spoke of the day's grim events. From the theatre wing, almost imperceptible yet completely steady, the ghost light maintained its unreasonable fidelity, casting shadows that seemed to shift and whisper in the darkness. Inspector Alleyn had prepared his vigil with characteristic precision, understanding that truth often revealed itself when those who guarded it believed themselves unobserved. In the antechamber to what had been Rosamond's chambers, he had arranged his subtle indicators with the care of a stage manager. A slip of tissue laid like frost edge in the door jamb, the corner of a rug drawn a fraction from the skirting, a chair turned slightly from its habitual angle so that the least disturbance would be legible to eyes trained in observation. "No more than a courtesy to the truth," he had murmured to Inspector Fox, who waited with characteristic patience in the shadows. The merest disturbance set these small devices whispering their alarm. The tissue parted with a breath, the chair showed a new crescent pressed into the carpet's nap, and Alleyn's hand, extended in a gesture that seemed almost amiable, brought the door wide. in the spill of candlelight, Peregrine Dacre knelt before opened drawers, his long fingers moving through delicate fabrics and personal effects with desperate efficiency. His evening clothes were disheveled, his carefully arranged hair falling across his forehead, while about him lay the evidence of systematic search conducted with the urgency of a man whose time had run out. "My dear Mr. Dacres," Alleyn said with quiet courtesy, and the playwright started with such violence that the candle flame wavered, casting grotesque shadows across the rose-papered walls. His attempt at theatrical dignity crumbled almost immediately, giving way to a confession that tumbled forth with the relief of long-suppressed guilt. He spoke of debts that pressed upon him with increasing urgency, of creditors who would not be satisfied with promises, and of the desperate expedient that had led him to search for correspondence that might prove valuable to those who traded in scandal's currency. "I confess to a form of genteel blackmail," Dacre declared with elaborate self-condemnation, his hands gesturing with unconscious grace despite his distress. "Trading knowledge for silence, secrets for sovereigns. It is not beautiful, Inspector, but it has its own tradition." His voice carried that note of theatrical resignation which seemed calculated to disarm suspicion, yet beneath the performance lay genuine desperation. "But murder? I swear to you I feared only exposure, never contemplating such a solution to anyone's difficulties." His account of the fateful blackout carried conviction mixed with bewilderment. During those crucial seconds of manufactured darkness, he had heard distinctly a stifled sob followed by the clearly spoken word, "Father," which he claimed to have assumed referred to the Reverend Mr. Rivington's ecclesiastical title rather than any more intimate relationship. "I thought perhaps she sought spiritual comfort," he explained, genuine confusion flickering in his eyes. An unusual time, to be sure, but Rosamond was a creature of impulse. But to kill her for a confession to a man of God? The question hung in the air like an accusation against logic itself. In the morning room, where Crown Derby china caught the pale light of dawn and the faint bloom of frost decorated the window panes, Miss Adelaide Carston received Alleyn with that composed formality she seemed to have perfected with her first silver hair. Her keys lay upon the tray with sober glitter, while her hands remained folded in her lap with the rigid control that spoke of emotions held in severe check. When questioned about the anonymous note, her composure fractured momentarily, revealing beneath her genteel exterior a steel-like determination that had driven her to action she now regarded with something approaching regret. "An anonymous note was placed under my door," she admitted, her voice carrying quiet firmness despite the evident distress. "It begged, no other word will do, that the wedding be stopped. I burned it immediately in the small fire in the china cupboard." Her eyes met Alleyn's with defiant pride. "It is not our custom to permit nameless hands to arrange our affairs. I acted to spare Julian the agony of doubt and suspicion on what should have been his happiest day. One must maintain standards, Inspector, whatever the cost." Julian himself, when questioned about his movements during the crucial evening, proved a study in barely controlled hysteria. His responses came in fragments, interrupted by silences that stretched toward breaking, his hands trembling with such violence that Dr. Pargeter was summoned with quiet urgency. The physician's calming draught quieted the young man's physical distress, yet even as the medication took effect, there remained in his eyes a quality of growing terror that no pharmaceutical remedy could address. The look of a man who had glimpsed something that challenged the very foundations of his understanding. Sir Lionel withdrew even further into the fortress of formal courtesy that had sustained his family through generations of crisis, his responses carrying the weight of absolute authority, tempered by profound exhaustion. He spoke of family honor and proper standards with measured precision, yet beneath his courtly manner lay something approaching desperation, as if he recognized that the careful edifice of respectability he had spent decades constructing was crumbling beneath the weight of revealed truth. The Unveil maintained her vigil near the theater, with the dedication of one guarding sacred ground, her presence in the corridors at all hours, suggesting a woman who found sleep impossible while surrounded by memories that could not be safely explained to people of Witchford's ancient blood and rigid traditions. When encountered by Alleyn during his own nocturnal observations, she offered no explanation for her restlessness, merely inclining her head with professional courtesy before continuing her solitary patrol. The servants, anxious yet shrewdly observant, provided intelligence that spoke to a household where tension had become almost palpable. Mrs. Arkwright reported with professional concern that certain small items continued to be moved during the night hours. Gloves repositioned from chair to table, a gentleman's boutonniere relocated from one vase to another, a little pot of grease paint mysteriously displaced from the theatre's property room to a location where it might more easily be discovered. "Someone's tidying up," she observed, with the authority of one who understood the significance of domestic details, but not in any way that makes proper sense. As morning light began to filter through the frost-touched windows, the great house seemed to draw a deep, collective breath and hold it, waiting for the inevitable moment when truth would finally demand its due. The very air carried a quality of suppressed knowledge, as if the ancient walls themselves participated in the conspiracy of silence that had governed the household since tragedy had first disturbed its careful order. In the theatre, where the ghost light burned with solitary persistence, a single white petal lay upon the music stand, thick and waxen as virtue at Witchford, made to endure, yet somehow speaking of fragility and the terrible cost of secrets maintained too long. The second silence that had fallen upon the house proved even more ominous than the first, pregnant with revelations that would transform understanding and shatter the comfortable assumptions upon which the entire household had built its sense of security. In the growing light, the portraits of dead Carstons seemed to lean forward from their frames, their painted eyes reflecting not merely the morning sun, but the accumulated weight of family secrets that could no longer be contained within the elegant discretion that had protected them for so many years. The morning light at Witchford Park possessed that particular quality of winter clarity which follows upon frost, transforming the library windows into sheets of polished silver, while casting the accumulated shadows of the investigation into sharp relief. Inspector Alleyn stood before the mahogany writing desk, where evidence had been arranged with the precision of a scholar preparing his most crucial lecture, each item positioned to catch the light in a way that would illuminate not merely its physical properties, but its significance in the larger pattern that was emerging with inexorable logic. The soft kid glove lay open upon the leather surface, its left palm worn smooth by habitual use in a way that spoke of a hand more active than its fellow, while beside it rested the fragments of a gentleman's boutonniere. Gardenia petals, thick as cream, their exotic fragrance still clinging despite the passage of days. Inspector Fox approached with characteristic discretion, his notebook containing the methodical observations that had slowly transformed a collection of curious details into something approaching certainty. "The hands tell their own story, Fox," Alleyn observed quietly, lifting the glove to examine the distinctive wear pattern that marked it as belonging to someone whose left hand reached, grasped, and manipulated with the confidence born of long practice. Notice how the leather has shaped itself to accommodate a particular grip. This is not mere preference, but physical necessity. His grey eyes moved to the boutonniere with its betraying fragrance. And here we have scent where it should not logically be found, transferred through contact intimate enough to leave its mark upon delicate lace. The chalk smear upon a fragment of the fatal veil provided the final element in this trinity of evidence, its pale dust speaking of contact with the stage marks that had guided the mask's choreography. Alleyn held the lace to the window light, noting how the chalk had been pressed into the weave with sufficient force to suggest not casual brushing, but deliberate, close contact. "Someone moved nearer than the prescribed distance during that crucial blackout," he murmured, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a puzzle solver who had found the piece that made sense of the whole. "Close enough to transfer stage chalk?" close enough to breathe gardenia scent onto silk, close enough to accomplish what required both opportunity and the physical capability that Sir Lionel's aging frame could never have managed. He spoke quietly with Fox about the significance of hands and habits, about the geometry of movement within the theater's confined space, and about who possessed both the dexterity to tie that curiously constructed knot and the intimate knowledge of theatrical geography that had made such swift, silent action possible. The distances involved were small, 7 paces at most, yet in the complete darkness of the blackout, they required the sort of confident navigation that spoke of long familiarity with every rope, every piece of scenery, every potential obstacle that might impede swift movement. The Reverend Mr. Rivington arrived at the library with obvious reluctance, his clerical collar seeming to constrict his breathing as he prepared to release himself from the bonds of pastoral discretion that had constrained his earlier testimony. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted the chair Alleyn offered, while his eyes carried the burden of a conscience finally compelled to choose between spiritual confidence and earthly justice. When he spoke, however, his voice possessed the clarity of one who had wrestled with duty and found his course. "She came to me before dawn," he said, his words measured with the precision of a man who understood their weight. Not merely for prayer, but for guidance in circumstances that seemed to offer no comfortable resolution. She had discovered things about her parentage, legal documents that confirmed what she had begun to suspect. His voice caught slightly as he continued, describing how Rosamond had declared with passionate intensity that she could not proceed with a marriage until she had told him the complete truth about her identity and her fears. She used that word, Inspector him, with such emphasis that it seemed to carry meanings far beyond its surface simplicity. She would not be moved from her resolution. Alleyn contemplated the terrible weight of that simple word, father, and its dual significance within the context of Wychford Park's carefully maintained hierarchies. There were only 2 men in the household whom such a revelation could wound beyond reason or endurance: Sir Lionel, who had feared the confirmation of his suspicions about her parentage, and Julian, who would have faced the destruction of everything he believed about love, marriage, and the fundamental order of his existence. Yet the physical evidence spoke clearly of capabilities that eliminated one possibility while confirming the other: the strength required to accomplish murder in those crucial seconds, the left-handed dexterity revealed in the fatal knot, the intimate knowledge of theatrical space that had made possible such swift and purposeful action. He reflected, too, upon the tender care taken with the dead girl's hair after violence had been done, that post-mortem ministration that spoke of hands familiar with such gentle services. There was in this detail a quality of possessive love that preferred to claim ownership through death, rather than accept the pain of willing release or the ignominy of public exposure, suggesting a mind that saw murder not as destruction, but as preservation, keeping forever what might otherwise be lost to revelation and the consequent collapse of carefully maintained illusions. With methodical precision that betrayed no trace of theatrical bravado, Alleyn arranged for all the principal figures to attend what he termed a final rehearsal in the theater itself. The invitations were issued with courteous formality, each person requested to take their position exactly as before, with the chalk marks clearly visible on the floor and their task simply to demonstrate precisely what they had done, as if nothing tragic had occurred. "We shall reconstruct the evening's events," he explained to Sir Lionel with characteristic understatement, in the hope that repetition might illuminate what darkness has concealed. The theater filled slowly with reluctant participants, each person moving to their assigned position with the careful precision of actors who understood that this performance would conclude not with applause, but with revelation. Miss Ianthe Vale took her place in the front row with professional composure, while Peregrine Dacres arranged himself with subdued theatricality that seemed somehow diminished by the gravity of their circumstances. Julian Carstone moved to his mark with mechanical obedience, his face bearing that expression of rigid control which had become his habitual mask, while Dr. Pargeter and Miss Adelaide distributed themselves according to their remembered positions. As the afternoon light slanted through the theatre's tall windows, casting long shadows across the stage where tragedy had been enacted with such terrible artistry, Alleyn's manner possessed only the measured inevitability of justice finally prepared to speak its truth. The ghost light burned with solitary persistence, illuminating a space where the most convincing performance had taken place not upon the boards, but in the shadowed places where reality and artifice met in their eternal, dangerous dance. "Places, if you please," Alleyn said, his voice carrying easily through the intimate. Space, and the assembled company moved to their marks with the reluctant precision of those who understood that this final rehearsal would strip away the last vestiges of pretense. There was in his manner no dramatic flourish, no hint of the theatrical revelation that Mr. Dacres might have employed, only the quiet authority of truth finally demanding its due. The performance that was about to unfold would conclude not with the conventional satisfactions of theatrical resolution, but with a silence that would be understood by everyone present, a silence that would finally give voice to all that had been whispered in the dark, transforming secrets into revelation and bringing to light the terrible cost of love perverted into possession. In the gathering dusk, as the house prepared to witness its final act, there seemed to linger in the very air a quality of suspended breath, as if Wychford Park itself understood that the moment of truth had arrived at last, and that no amount of elegant discretion could any longer contain the knowledge that demanded its inevitable, inexorable due. The theatre at Wychford Park lay in the carefully controlled dimness of late afternoon, its intimate proportions seeming to compress around the assembled company like the walls of a confession booth where secrets could no longer find refuge in shadow. The ghost light burned with solitary persistence upon its stand, casting a pool of amber radiance that transformed the painted scenery into something approaching the sacred, while beyond its circle the velvet seats held their occupants in positions that seemed ordained by fate rather than choice. Inspector Alleyn stood upon the stage where tragedy had been enacted with such terrible artistry, his bearing suggesting not the theatrical revelation that convention might demand, but rather the quiet authority of truth, finally prepared to speak without embellishment or apology. The reconstruction proceeded with methodical precision, each participant taking their assigned position with the reluctant accuracy of those who understood that repetition might illuminate what darkness had concealed. Tom Beale's weathered hands moved over the lighting controls with professional competence, while Inspector Fox maintained his vigil with notebook ready, his stolid presence providing counterpoint to the theatre's atmosphere of elegant deception. "We shall proceed exactly as before," Alleyn announced, his voice carrying easily through the intimate space, with the understanding that truth requires no dramatic enhancement to make itself known. When the blackout descended with its complete and disorienting darkness, the silence that followed seemed to pulse with accumulated tension, each person isolated within the compass of their own breathing while the seconds stretched toward revelation. In that velvet void, Alleyn's voice came with quiet authority, describing how Rosamond had moved closer to Sir Lionel during those crucial moments, her whispered confession carrying the weight of discovery that had shattered her understanding of everything she had believed about her identity and her intended marriage. She spoke of her father, Alleyn said, his words seeming to echo in the manufactured darkness, not as a term of general respect, but as a specific identification that transformed her wedding from celebration into catastrophe. When the lights rose again with sudden brilliance, revealing the assembled company in their frozen tableau, Alleyn continued his quiet exposition without dramatic flourish, but with inexorable logic. Sir Lionel's shock at Rosamond's revelation, he explained, had indeed paralyzed the older man's judgment, yet it had not moved his hand to violence. The confirmation of his long-held suspicions had offered him precisely the escape from moral compromise that he had desperately sought. making murder not only unnecessary but counterproductive to his purposes. Sir Lionel had every reason to prevent the marriage, Alleyn observed with characteristic understatement, but none to commit murder when legal revelation would accomplish his ends without violence. The inspector's attention turned then to the systematic presentation of evidence that had accumulated with inexorable logic throughout the investigation. The fatal knot, he demonstrated with Tom Beale's assistance, required distinctly left-handed technique, not mere preference, but the natural dexterity of one whose dominant hand moves with practiced confidence. He lifted the soft kid glove that had been discovered, its left palm worn smooth by habitual use. The grease paint transferred to the veil spoke of contact with painted scenery during swift movement in darkness, movement guided by intimate knowledge of theatrical space. His grey eyes moved deliberately across the assembled figures. And the distinctive scent of gardenia, exotic and unmistakable, lingered where it should not have been found. Not the simple flowers of a lady's corsage, but the sophisticated choice of one accustomed to theatrical effect. The evidence converged with mathematical precision upon Miss Ianthe Vale, who sat perfectly straight in the front row, her professional composure intact despite the growing weight of revelation that seemed to accumulate around her like gathering shadows. Alleyn's voice carried that note of profound sadness which marked his recognition of human tragedy beneath criminal act as he described the gentle care taken afterward, the smoothing of hair, the tender arrangement of hands, speaking not of impersonal violence but of hands familiar with such ministrations, of love perverted into possession that preferred to claim ownership through death rather than accept the pain of willing release. Miss Vale's composure, maintained through decades of professional discipline, began to show the first hairline cracks of approaching collapse. Her hands, previously folded with characteristic control, began to tremble almost imperceptibly, while something flickered behind her austere features that suggested the approach of recognition too complete to be denied. When she spoke, her voice carried the trained clarity of well-schooled diction, though the words seemed to cost her considerable effort. She was going to destroy everything, she said, the admission emerging with the reluctance of truth finally compelled to speech. Not from malice, but from innocence. That terrible innocence that sees only its own truth and cannot comprehend the consequences for others. The confession that followed came not with theatrical drama, but with the quiet devastation of a life's careful construction finally crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. Miss Vale spoke of years spent watching Rosamond grow from promising student into accomplished performer, of professional guidance that had gradually transformed into something approaching maternal possession, and of the terrible moment when she had realized that revelation of the girl's true parentage would destroy not merely the marriage, but the entire edifice of respectability that had been built upon foundations of careful concealment. "I could not bear to lose her," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the theatre's hushed atmosphere. Not to scandal, not to shame, not to the sort of exposure that would have made her name a byword for impropriety. Miss Adelaide Carston covered her face with trembling hands. Her prayer offered not for appearances or reputation, but for the broken souls trapped within expectations too rigid to accommodate human frailty. Julian Carstone sat perfectly still, his face bearing that expression of absolute incomprehension which marks those whose understanding of the world has been fundamentally altered by revelation. Sir Lionel maintained his composure with the discipline of generations, though his eyes carried the weight of a man who had witnessed the final collapse of everything he had sought to protect. Alleyn spoke in his concluding words not merely of the mechanics of murder, but of its deeper significance, of shame cherished like a sacred relic and duty perverted into possessive claim. He described the inevitable catastrophe that follows when truth is not permitted to breathe freely in the light of day, when love becomes indistinguishable from ownership and protection, transforms into destruction. The tragedy, he observed with profound gentleness, lies not in the crime itself, but in the circumstances that made it seem, to one tormented mind, the only possible solution to an impossible situation. Miss Grey's whisper in the darkness was her final attempt to speak truth. It was silenced by one who believed preservation of reputation mattered more than preservation of life. As the afternoon shadows lengthened through the theatre's tall windows and the ghost light continued its solitary vigil, Inspector Alleyn prepared to depart from Witchford Park, and as he had entered it, with courtesy, discretion, and respect for the living, the great house settled into the long, difficult work of learning to exist with knowledge it had tried so desperately not to possess, while somewhere in its ancient corridors there seemed to linger the echo of a whisper that had cost so much to silence and would cost even more to remember. The bride's last whisper had finally found its voice, not in the darkness where it was spoken, but in the light of truth that no amount of elegant discretion could any longer contain.